her mother and sister were deported to Theresienstadt, a concentration camp in what is now the Czech Republic, where she survived for 2.5 years. And my grandfather Hansi, who at that time was 17 years old, slightly older than Helga, who was 14. Hansi was hidden by his former school doctor and stayed hidden in his Vienna apartment also for 2.5 years until the liberation. So, you know, and about all the details and what happened to them and how they actually survived, you have to read in the book. But they did meet after the war, shortly after. So I also tell that story of how they then, after they both studied medicine and got married, briefly moved to the US, but then decided to return to Vienna.
Okay. They were living in Poughkeepsie, where they were working as medical doctors, and then decided to come back to the States. So in your research, you went to a lot of the places that they survived, where they survived. You went to Theresienstadt, where your grandmother survived the war, and your great aunt as well. You also went to the Vienna State Opera, where your grandfather was able to attend many performances during the war. He was 17 years old and went to opera performances to go to standing room only section of the opera. Why don't you read to us the section about his experience doing that and what that was like?
Sure. I haven't actually ever read it in English. I've only always read the German part, so this is going to be new for me too.
The book was beautifully translated by Alta Price. So.
Very nice. Neubaugasse. In the winter of 1942, Peppy was given a ticket for a performance at the Vienna State Opera and passed it on to Hansi. At that first performance, Hansi discovered two things: his love of opera and cheap standing room tickets. The next evening, he went right back, bought a ticket for 70 pfennigs, and saw Aida while leaning against the railing of the fourth floor balcony. He kept going regularly, often several times a week. He had never cared about opera before. Nobody in his family had been musically inclined either. But now he couldn't get enough. It became part of his everyday life. He was often among the first in line when the standing section tickets went on sale each afternoon. The program during the Nazi period wasn't very different from the years before and after. In addition to Wagner and Beethoven, Italian composers like Verdi and Puccini were popular. Hansi saw Madame Butterfly and La Bohème at least 8 times each, Tosca at least 6, and La Traviata at least 5. Soon he knew the various singers' strengths and weaknesses, and he leaned even farther over the railing as he applauded their particularly successful parts. He read their names in the printed program, which cost about 50 pfennig, then carefully folded the piece of paper lengthwise and saved it in a folder at home. If there were substitutions, he wrote in the understudies by hand. If he didn't have enough money for the program, he noted the date, opera title, and singers of the main roles on a piece of paper and added it to his collection, which by the end of the war consisted of 117 programs. I find the stash in a grayish cardboard folder in his old study. I slipped the thin double-sided programs into transparent sheet protectors, sort them into chronological order, and put them in a 3-ring binder. As I leaf through the portfolio, it occurs to me that I just might be holding Hansi's most precious private possession from that period. The programs cost almost as much as the tickets themselves. They're like a diary, pieces of evidence proving his existence. More than a year later, in winter 2016, I decide to go to the opera myself. I've hardly been interested in the genre since the last music class I took back in high school. The teacher, watching us vigilantly, would have us follow the notes of piano excerpts. He'd stalk through the room as some opera burst forth from the speakers, then suddenly stop behind one of our students. If you had your finger on the right page, or better yet, the right bar, he'd move on. Then I went off to study in England and the United States. Now I'm back in Vienna. And just as I encountered incomprehension among the Jews of New York, who wondered how my family could ever live in Austria, people now routinely tell me how inexplicable they find it that I moved back to Vienna after 3 years in New York. I had a job after all, a job in journalism and a work visa. I hem and haw and indulge in all the comparative cliches. The quality of life is so much better in Vienna. Everything just moves so fast in New York. Sometimes I respond by talking about the stingy landlady who refused to turn the heat up in winter, or the Jewish weekly where I worked. For the most part, it was great, but did I really always want to write about the same topics? Or the time zone difference that made it so difficult to connect with friends and family in Europe by phone? I tell people I'm working on this book and prefer to be close to the places I'm writing about. I gave the same vague answers I had back in New York when people asked why my grandparents had decided to spend their lives in Vienna after the war. But now, those are all just excuses. I know the real answer, but I'm ashamed to admit it. In New York, I was lonelier than I'd ever been before. Sure, it wasn't hard to keep busy and constantly meet new people. I even got used to eating alone more often. But I missed the family I had grown up in. From the uppermost standing section at the Vienna State Opera, I look out across the entire auditorium. Music lovers appreciate the acoustics up here. Perhaps both of these aspects were among the reasons why Hansi liked being here. Spots in the standing section on the ground floor cost a little more too, a full Reichsmark instead of 70 pfennigs. How dangerous was it for Hansi to go to the opera? In the event of a raid, making an inconspicuous escape would have been impossible. My grandfather writes that no one ever asked for his papers at the opera. Was he just lucky enough to not be there during a raid? Or was the opera never subject to such searches? The police checked IDs in all sorts of places and would cordon off the entire area until they were done. Movie theaters were frequent targets for such raids, which is why Hansi avoided them throughout the war. But what about the opera? Hansi writes that many performances were almost exclusively reserved for various Nazi affiliate organizations, and the only tickets sold to the public were for the standing sections. The audience was always swarming with uniformed men. Maybe that's why the authorities didn't bother with raids there. The overture to the Magic Flute begins. I'm surrounded by tourists. I recognize familiar melodies and I'm grateful to my strict old music teacher had us listen to operas like this and explained how music is such an integral part of Viennese history and culture. The thought occurs to me. I belong to Vienna, so this music belongs to me too. And I suspect Hansi felt the same. Jews were banned from theaters, movies, and concert halls on November 12, 1938. Their exclusion from cultural life meant that they were no longer part of a unified whole. At the opera, Hansi belonged again. He saw the Magic Flute twice, on May 10, 1943, and almost exactly a year later, on May 14, 1944. After a few weeks, Hansi noticed several other men of military age on the fourth floor balcony who, like him, weren't in uniform. How did they have time to go to the opera? Were there other people in hiding among his fellow regulars? He didn't dare ask. The only interactions we had were all about music, he writes. During performances, they would comment on the singing through glances and gestures. During intermissions, they would talk about the singers, the conductor, and the sets. They seemed to have an unspoken agreement that their particular living conditions and everything else that existed outside that grand building on Vienna's Ringstraße remained cloaked in silence.
Thank you. So cloaked in silence. Cloaked in silence is something that also could refer to the way Austria has dealt with its Nazi past and how much it has Austrian society has been willing to discuss and talk about what had happened actually under the Nazis. Your grandparents survived, your grandmother survived Theresienstadt, your grandfather, through the tremendous courage and help of the doctor who hid him in his home, was able to survive. But then they found themselves living in Vienna in the immediate aftermath, and their relatives in the States who had left Vienna were encouraging them to leave. What was their response to those pleas from the relatives abroad that they should leave? How did they respond initially? Did they go quickly to Poughkeepsie? How did they?
So from the letters that I found, what happened is that Hansi's cousin wanted him to come to the US basically right after the war, because his aunt had survived there and like some parts of the family. But Hansi didn't want to. I think there were a couple of reasons, some quite pragmatic ones. For example, the language, because Hansi's English wasn't that good at the time, and he was doing an exam to finish for a high school diploma. And it's quite funny. I found one of those old letters where Hansi seemed to complain that he had to take Latin classes, and then his cousin replied, "Oh, you should come to the US. We don't do Latin here." And all those, like, she really tried very hard to convince him to come, but he didn't want to. And then he started studying medicine, and then he wanted to complete his degree in Vienna. But I do think the main reason why he didn't want to come was because of Peppy, his school doctor, who saved him and who, after the war, turned out to be his only surviving family, because his parents and his brother, his younger brother, were killed. So Peppy did adopt Hansi a few years after the war, since they had a very close relationship. And Peppy at that point was, I think, in his late 60s or something, so not the ideal age to resettle. And they also had a reasonably comfortable life in Vienna, with Peppy having, a big group of friends and family whom he trusted. So I think it was also a point of, not really wanting to leave a network they had.
Could I ask you to read one other short passage starting at the top of page 180 about their experience in Poughkeepsie? We have a little time to do that. So from the top of 180 to the end of the first paragraph on 181, if you would.
First paragraph, sure. Were my grandparents lonely and socially isolated, as one sometimes hears immigrants say? Quite the contrary. It seems they could barely say no to all the invitations. Fellow doctors and hospital employees had them over, and they went to parties and the movies. One family that had to travel for several weeks even generously let them stay in their stately home while they were away. Helga and Hansi spent most of their time in the living room, listening to records. Time and again, they'd run into acquaintances from Vienna who had emigrated, like them. They spent their free weekends in New York City with the family, who wanted to show them around town and help them integrate. They went to concerts, the theater, and museums, and they enjoyed lavish dinners for the Jewish holidays. Hansi appreciated his intelligent and attentive aunt, his engaged and family-oriented cousin, and his good-natured and amicable uncle. Helga's memories of Hansi's family are also very positive. In July, Hansi writes Peppi that a friendly fellow Jewish doctor invited him to go swimming at a Jewish lake. Poughkeepsie's Jews have bought their own lake. Everything here is separated. There isn't much mixing. People stay in their own little circles with others of the same social background. Helga confirms it. She had found the degree of racial segregation, in particular, deeply disturbing. The staff of the hospital was mixed. The fellow interns included a Black doctor, and her senior physician was Black as well. On paper, New York was one of the most progressive states when it came to anti-discrimination legislation. A government commission against discrimination at work had been introduced in 1945. From 1952 onward, people could sue for unequal treatment in public places. By 1954, segregation in schools had been declared illegal nationwide. Reality was rather different, Helga learned, when one of her Black colleagues gave her a lift into the center of Poughkeepsie. Helga asked if he'd like to go shopping with her. He declined, saying that he couldn't be seen beside a white woman in public. She was no less disturbed upon learning that an Austrian acquaintance who worked at the same hospital often wasn't invited when they were. Jewish doctors invited the Jewish couple, but not their non-Jewish friend. I had had enough of that during the war, says Helga. So rigid, racist social conventions certainly played a major role in their decision to return to Europe.
So this description of the racial segregation that they found in Poughkeepsie in the 1950s has particular resonance given what's going on in the United States today. But surely when your grandparents returned to Vienna in the 1950s, they didn't exactly find an incredibly enlightened society about the presence of outsiders in the society. And Austria still has, although it has come quite a long way in discussing the Nazi past and its role in the perpetration of Nazi crimes, there's still a considerable debate on how much restitution has been given and how welcome foreigners are made to feel in Vienna today. Could you tell us a little bit about how your grandparents adjusted when they came back, and what kind of experience they had, and how you see things in Vienna today? You've been reporting on the plans to construct a new national memorial to the Holocaust, which has been it's causing some controversy.
Yeah, so I did. So my grandmother is still alive. She's 91 now. So for when I researched this book, I did talk to her a lot, and so I did also ask her about this whole, how did you actually feel when you came back? What was it like returning to Vienna? And I think what she said a couple of things that were really interesting. So one thing she said is, like, when she returned, she said she was full of anger, and like such an anger for all the years of unfair treatment. I think the way she put it, was I wanted to see a Nazi hang on each like lamppost on the street, that kind of thing, which is very unusual for her because she's a very calm, not very emotional person. So I asked her, so what happened? How did the anger go away? And then she said there were two things. One is that she just kept really busy because she went back to school and skipped some classes because she was 17 now and had only been to school until age 12. But she didn't want to go back to the grade appropriate for age 12, but for age 17. So she had to do a lot of studying, and she felt the need to prove everyone that she was worthy. So she worked very hard, which is a good distraction. And she said the other thing is at school, which was at an all-girls school, which was usual at that time, she just experienced that like her other classmates had also suffered a lot during the war, because there were also, you know, young women basically innocent and victims in a sense. So she said she sort of, you know, she realized that like she wasn't the only one who had been treated unfairly. So I think those were the things she said that helped her adjust. It might have been slightly different with my grandfather Hansi. I think for him a lot was this very close relationship to Peppy that, you know, made him stay in Vienna and also always feel at home in Vienna.
Your grandmother, although she was she experienced firsthand this persecution, she also emphasized to you the goodness that she found. I mean, her husband survived as the result of some Austrian goodness and personal courage, which was hardly commonplace in Vienna. But she always did want to say that history was never always black and white. Is that how did she convey that to you in the way she talked about the Austrians to you?
So she does like telling an anecdote from the time during the war. So it must have been in the early 40s. She must have been quite young then, maybe 12 or 13. And she said she was walking along a big major square in Vienna when suddenly a woman she didn't know came up to her and smacked her and said, "You filthy Jew." And then she says, "Yeah, but I also have to tell you this story. And another time I was walking on that same square and a woman I didn't know came up to me and gave me a couple of oranges and said, 'Poor kid, here you go.'" So that's, you know, that's in a sense of, I think, how she sees the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So tell us a little bit about what's going on now with this plan to build a National Holocaust Memorial. There already is a memorial in Vienna that I was based in Vienna as a correspondent in the 1980s until 1992, when there was a monument built to Austrian victims of the Holocaust, which was very controversial, but that wasn't specifically a Jewish memorial. So now there's plans to build a different memorial. Could you tell us a little bit about that and why it's taken so long, and if this is really a good thing or not?
Well, taking so long, we already have a really beautiful memorial for the Jewish victims of the Holocaust in Vienna. Was designed by I think she's British, Rachel Whitehead, an architect.
White Reed, I think, right?
Yeah, and it's like a library with the books turned inside out, and it has the name of the concentration camps, and so we do have that space. But then 2 years ago, 2018, we had a coalition government with the far right party that you know, used to have Nazi ties, still has some Nazi ties. And a few weeks after that government was inaugurated in March 2018, also the 80th anniversary of the Anschluss, suddenly it was announced that Vienna is going to get another Holocaust memorial, and it's going to be a wall with the names of all Austrian Jewish Holocaust victims, around 64,000, like the known ones. And that was announced 2 years ago, and now a few weeks ago, they actually started building it, which is when it came, you know, it gained media attention again. And there's a couple of things really weird about it. It's also like it was a project that came out of the blue. There was no like call for participation, as it's usual with these things, because they cost a couple of million euros, but you know, there was nothing, and like the government just decided this is what it's going to be. It's not really a well thought project. It's just going to be a wall with names, which I I talked to a couple of historians. They say, you know, when it comes to monuments, that's really quite an outdated, you know, way to do. So also the whole question, like if you already have a monument for Jews, why would you do another one? Why don't you do a different one? Why, you know, why only Austrian victims and so on? Like lots of not very well thought through, which in a way might be symbolic of how Austria still approaches its history. Like they're trying, but in many cases and not all of the cases, there are a lot of people who really, you know, really thinking a lot about history and not trying to do the same mistakes. But it does happen that, you know, it is treated quite superficially and with a sort of like this fig leaf. It has this touch of Jews being a fig leaf because it's only 10 to 15,000 here in Vienna. And, you know, everyone can agree with, like, the Holocaust was bad and Jews are not the problem anymore. But then like, there's more controversy, like how do you deal with the Muslim population and foreigners and refugees? So even the right wing is like, yeah.
And as a Jewish Austrian who is somewhat prominent in the media and you're writing on sensitive issues at times, do you experience anti-Semitism or in encounters with Austrian officials or other people? Do you, is it a problem?
I mean, not in my face, you know, obviously on the internet, people write all sorts of sort of weird stuff, but it's relatively little.
Okay. Unfortunately, we've heard that Nancy Sinkoff is not going to be able to make it this evening. So Anna, we can go on a little bit longer.
Sure, I'm awake.
Okay, we very much regret that Nancy can't make it. Her book is fascinating and I hope she will have another time when she's able to talk about it, but she's having trouble with her voice and she's not able to make it this evening. Anna, can I ask you to read one more brief passage that deals with the memory of Pepe and how your family debated how he might be commemorated on page 194?
94
until the bottom of the second paragraph on 195. Ending, I don't know.
Okay. Yes. After Pepe's death in 1973, the family suggested having a tree planted for him along the Avenue of the Righteous at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. An Israeli commission awards the title Righteous Among the Nations to those who rescued Jews under Nazi persecution. To this day, Pepe is not one of them. He wouldn't have wanted that under any circumstances, Hansi said. He found such sentimental gestures offensive. To Pepe, what he had done was self-evident. Why should he be honored for not doing the wrong thing? For a long time, this struck me as incomprehensible. How could a monument be bad if it moved people to see Pepe as a role model and emulate his behavior? I had always listened in as members of our extended family were ranked according to whether they would hide us. My grandmother's longtime medical secretary? Absolutely. My cousin's former nanny? Probably not. My classmates' parents? Maybe. Many of Pepe's traits were inherited by the family. The art of listening and questioning, for example. Pepe taught Hansi, who passed it on to my mother, who used it on me. If someone annoyed or offended me, she would let me tell her all about it and ask if I could guess why they might have done what they did. Today, I consider listening to people the most strenuous aspect of my job as a journalist. I have to pay close attention to what people say, suss out whether they're saying it merely because they think I want to hear it, and then formulate my next question. Pepe's sheer courage and recklessness often make such family law sound like a bunch of adventurous stories. But I'm a long way from all that. Would I be capable of standing up against a seemingly invincible, perilous power? I don't know.
So he is not honored at Yad Vashem. Do you think you might advocate for a plaque on the house where your grandfather survived, that there was this brave doctor who hid him?
I don't know. Maybe not the plaque. So what happened, it's actually quite interesting. I think about a year ago, Peppy and Hansi, they met at the high school in Vienna because Hansi was a student there for about a year and Peppy was a school doctor there. That's how they got to know each other. And this school, it's, you know, a very, very mixed high school, very engaged teachers, and they did invite me to read. They also helped me with my research with the archives, and they also invited my grandmother. And then they approached my family about a year ago, saying they wanted to put a plaque for Peppy on the school. And what did we think about it? And we thought about it, and then we did say, well, yeah, they can do a plaque, but we think that's not enough. We want the students to learn and think about Peppy, so we would only want to have a plaque if it was in addition to something else, say, I don't know, like an annual prize given for courageous students or some sort of scholarship or any sort of activity that's more educational than just a plaque. Mm-hmm. Now that I think about it, I don't think they didn't pull through with the plaque, but then COVID happened, so I need to check up.
Before COVID, your grandmother has been active going to schools and talking to students about her own experience.
Yes, very much so. She's quite unhappy because she is bored at home.
Okay. All right. We're going to ask for some questions through the chat, and if people would like to ask questions, now's the time. We have one question. Debbie Greenberg wants to know, and who actually she's the former president of Anshe Chesed, who recently met with your. She was on an archaeological dig, I believe, with your second cousin.
Linda, and my cousin is there as well. Hi.
She found her name in your acknowledgement, so that's a nice coincidence of Jewish geography. Did your grandparents have close friends in Austria who were not Jewish? Or were their social circles largely Jewish? Or often people in Austria refer to Mischlingen. So I'm just wondering.
No, I think they were quite mixed. I'm trying to think. It's really sad because my grandmother is 91 now, so most of her friends have passed away. So I'm trying to think who are the people she would meet up. I think it was mixed because they were working as doctors. So you know the medical community was quite mixed.
Right. Okay. There's an opera question. The Vienna State Opera is on the cover of the book. We have a question saying that you said that your second opera your grandfather saw was Aida. Do you know what the first one was? Do you know?
Oh my God, I need to. I definitely do know. I'm not sure I have that information right here now.
Yes. Okay.
Didn't it say in that part?
As your editor, I should remember, but I know the next. You don't necessarily say it was necessarily.
Aida was the first one.
Okay.
Oh no, so Aida. No, actually, I don't know. I have to look it up. I think it's somewhere in his notes. I can.
All right.
Sorry.
He was able to go to the opera. He also went to the public library and read books. He couldn't go to school, but he was able to sort of maneuver around the city in relative freedom and not be recognized as a Jew. And there were how many, these people who were living as what they call U-boat, they were sort of underground or in submarine type life. Mm-hmm. There were hundreds of Jews who did survive the war that way in Vienna, right?
Yeah, the numbers, they aren't very good. They aren't very reliable, but I did read one paper that said that about 1,000 Jews at least survived some period of time as an U-boat in Austria.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. One attendee wants to know a little bit about how Jewishly you were raised, and your mother, how much of a religious education she had, and how Jewishly you yourself were raised. I know you've been involved in Zionist youth organizations.
I was in a Hashomer Hatzeya, which I think you have in the US too, but it's sort of organized a bit differently. So yeah, I was there, but I didn't go to a Jewish school. I had very little religious education. My grandfather, Hansi, was a stout atheist. So we did do the holidays, and we still do, but not very religious.
Mm-hmm. Do you know of other families who, there were other people who also came back to Vienna. Someone is asking the question whether other Jews who came back. There's a very interesting journalist, author, Hilda Spiel, who she survived the war in London, and she wrote a wonderful memoir called Return to Vienna about her experience. She survived the war in London and then came back to Vienna immediately afterwards. And she has an incredible scene in that book where she talks about going to her favorite cafe, and the waiter immediately greets her and starts to wail about how difficult his life was, whereas her friends and relatives have been killed and she had to flee for his life. But this waiter is bemoaning his fate and how difficult the war was, which many Austrians failed to recognize the pain that was endured by Jewish Austrians. Do you know of many other Jewish families that had survived? Survived and came back? Are you friendly with any families like that?
I mean, yeah, quite a lot of my Jewish friends have, their grandparents in Vienna. Though I'm not sure all of them actually lived in Vienna before the war. Like, a lot of them came after the war from sort of surrounding countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Linda is your cousin, right? Linda Savignon is your cousin. She asks, she says, I love the book about our family's history. Can you please speak about the extremely close-knit family of Hans, Litzi, Fred, Ilse before the war, and how each of them ended in a different continent, but how they still maintained their closeness despite all the adversity and distance, reunions, traveling together through the third generation.
So Hansi's mother had a twin, an identical twin, and an older sister. So there were 3 sisters, and they were very close since their mother had passed away at quite a young age. And Hansi had a younger brother, and her twin sister had one daughter, Litzi, who is Linda's mother, and there was an older sister who had 2 kids. And they were very close. They lived close to each other in Vienna. They would spend every Sunday doing things together, going on hikes or playing, and they would go on holidays together. And all the 3 sisters, they had one furniture shop each. So, it's sort of funny because in a way they were actually competition, but then they weren't. But then, their lives completely changed in 1938, and all 3 sisters scrambled to at least get their kids out of the country. And quite a few of them succeeded. So Litzi, Hansi's cousin, went on a kinder transport, and so did 2 of his other cousins. Litzi later, sort of complicated, but I'll make it short. So they then went to one sister went to the US and then had her daughter come also to the US, and then the other 2 kids in London, one stayed and the other one went to Australia. And it was actually only Hansi and his brother who weren't able to go away, and his parents as well as his aunt passed away, were killed.
And your own decision to return to Vienna, I mean, some of what you read about your grandparents, you asked, were they lonely? You missed the family meals, you missed your family, you missed the sense of the language. Is your return to Vienna permanent? Do you think you'll always stay there, or you may?
Yeah, I can't really think of going anywhere else right now. I mean, it's not really possible either.
Well, hopefully we will all go many places.
Yeah, I know, but I don't know. Like long term, I think I will stay in Vienna. I think I mean, I feel at home here in a way. I know like home is something very, you know, it can be taken from you at any moment. Like I don't take it for granted, but right now I do feel at home here, knowing it might not be like that forever. And also I feel in a way it's sort of, you know, I see it as some kind of political statement as well, because a society has to be kept as diverse as possible, and I'm part of a minority here, so I think it's important for me to be here and be present and, you know, show that history is still alive in a way.
Did your grandparents return to the US later in life? Did they go back after they had left Poughkeepsie? Did they come back on visits to New York or to visit relatives?
Yeah. A couple of times. My grandfather Hansi even went back for a couple of months each to work and earn some money, and they came to visit the family. I think the last time Helga was there, because Hansi died in 1996, so when I was quite little. Helga came for my graduation at Columbia.
Right. Photograph, right, at Columbia.
I can show. Hang on, it's in the book, right? I can show.
Sure.
Can show. You see.
Right.
Oh, yeah, that was 2013. She still looks like that.
And she, aside from the virus, she's well enough to move about and travel if she were able to. Yeah, I saw a video of her speaking at the Republikaner Club Österreich, where she was very dynamic, talking about with you. So. Okay. All right. Are there more questions? Let's see. Hang on. Your cousin wants to know what lesson you learned from your very detailed research.
What did I learn? Huh.
Learned to tell a story beautifully.
Sorry?
You've learned to tell a story beautifully and with weaving together many strands of a narrative, a complex narrative.
Yeah, and I think I just learned so much about history, and I discovered that approaching history through like a microcosm in a way, you know, just a family or even a city, is a really good way to understand it, because you know you don't really have to look at. I mean, you should also, but you don't just have to look at the big questions and the big world powers, but also just looking at how Vienna changed during the Nazi era and how it changed afterwards is very enlightening.
Right. Well, your book was praised by George Prochnow, who wrote The Impossible Exile about Stefan Zweig, as a book that forces us to reflect on what it means to try and live a normal life in the throes of a political nightmare. And your descriptions of Vienna as the Holocaust approached and how your family struggled to stay together and to make the decisions that they needed to make really does tell us that. Let's see. Did Pepe have family members? Are you in touch with any of them? Were there any cousins? He never married, so he didn't have children.
But he had a lot of siblings. Yeah, like Hansi it was very important to him to keep in touch with Pepe's family. That got a bit less after he died. So we sort of are, but it's very loosely. I did visit some relatives in Carinthia, which is the south of Austria, when I researched the book, which is also where Pepe is buried. So yeah, I went to see his grave
Mhm.
which is very odd because, you know, experiencing Pepe like just through the writing. I never met him. He was a very humble person, but then it's this big family crypt where he is buried. It seems sort of not fitting to him, but I guess
Right. Right.
he didn't really care that much.
There's another question from someone who's saying that they're having difficulty understanding how was it really possible for your grandfather to move about the city in the way that he did. Some of that you don't exactly know because you have diaries and some documentation, but how do you understand that he was able to move about? He didn't look stereotypically Jewish, or how was it?
He did. He has very dark hair and bushy eyebrows and a very prominent nose. He did look quite Jewish. And like there were a couple of factors. I think like you have to point out once again, he was just extremely lucky. Like everyone who survived the Holocaust was just lucky. And so was he. Also, I think he was quite careful and quite street smart, as he had been before the war. So he probably like knew his way around, like where to go, where there was little police, and that sort of stuff. And also at the point where he went into hiding in 1942, there was a time where there were already very few Jews in Vienna because they had already all been deported, and Hans's family was deported relatively late because his father worked for the Jewish community. So they like sort of, he was important and was saved for a while. So like they didn't really look for Jews. What they did look for was military deserters.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
And the neighbors in Pepe's building, they never reported him? You think that was out of goodwill towards Pepe, that he was someone that they respected, and some of the neighbors must have known what was going on.
Yeah, or they didn't. I think a lot of people, like Pepe didn't save Hansi on his own. There were a lot of people who knew and who helped him, because Pepe also had to get food and clothes and all that sort of stuff for Hansi. So he couldn't have done that on his own, even though like he worked as a doctor, but he didn't earn that much. Yeah, but Hansi writes that like people also didn't really care. Like 1942, 1943, there was already war. There was when, you know, things started getting bad. There was bombings. There was food shortage. There were all the men being killed in the war. So yeah, Hansi said that people just, you know, they didn't really care about Hitler and the regime that much anymore. They just, you know, cared about their own survival.
Can you tell us a little bit about the book's reception in Austria, and both critically and maybe how members of the Jewish community responded?
It was very positive. I mean, maybe it's an issue people here don't really dare, you know, criticizing too much in a way, or maybe the book is just really good. I don't know. It was very well received because, so what I heard quite often is that it felt like sort of an uplifting Holocaust story, which sounds a bit bizarre, but I guess in a way it is sort of lively, and I guess, you know, presented by me as a relatively young woman that, you know, brings history back to life, sort of thing. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. The book, as Anna's publisher, I can't keep myself from reminding you, it is for sale at newvesselpress.com. New Vessel Press is the publisher. It's also available at Amazon in your local independent bookshops. And try also on bookshop.com as a new website, which is helping independent booksellers to survive at this very difficult time. We are really very sorry that Nancy Sinkoff couldn't make it today. I want to remind you about her book, Lucy S. Davidovich, the New York, from left to right, Lucy S. Davidovich, the New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History. It's published by Wayne State University Press. And there's a link in the chat section of Zoom right now where you can get a 30% discount using the code SS20. And I hope that Nancy will have a chance to talk about it to the community very soon. It's a fantastic, very, very rich book. And we're sorry she's not able to be here tonight. So next, don't forget, next Monday night is the final session of Summer Stories. It's going to be hosted by Sheldon Lewis and will feature two outstanding journalists, Jeremy Kaplan, who will talk about entrepreneurial journalism, a new landscape for news, and Dan Friedman, who will address the challenges of Jewish journalism. We really want to thank Anna for being awake at what's now, I believe, 3 in the morning for her in Vienna, and we're very grateful for her participation. So thank
you for having me. That was great.
Okay. All right. Good night, everyone.